Jeanie. This is my cousin, Alan Borlaug, and he still calls me Norma Jean. So when I get a phone call in Texas and somebody says Norma Jean, I know automatically it's Alan, somebody from Iowa. But I'm glad to be here, and I was raised in Mexico City. My brother and I were raised in Mexico City. You know where Mexico is?
Yeah.
South of the border, right? And so we would come up to visit my grandparents, Norm's mother and dad, and his relatives, his mom and dad, and we would come up here every other year. So we didn't get up here very often. I was not raised in Iowa. But I have fond memories of coming and visiting in this house. And there used to be a big swing out on the porch. I started to say terrace. Porch, and we would have fun running around the barn, and it was all new to us because we were raised in a large city. So I come back here and it still seems like the same place. And I tell everybody when I go visit when I'm talking about my dad was three things to me. Or I think he represented three different entities. And one was he was a scientist. And he went to the University of Minnesota and got his PhD. He did all his degrees at Minnesota, even though he was from Iowa. And then he was a humanitarian. Do you know what humanitarian means? None of you know? Where does the word come from?
Human.
Human, good. So he liked helping other people. He was a humanitarian, and I'm sure many of you are humanitarians. If you're not, you're going to be, right? We all need to help each other, don't we? And then he was a teacher. He loved teaching, and he taught many students from around the world about agriculture. And if he were here today, he would love being with you. He loved young people, and he loved to talk and to teach. So those were the three things that really characterized what my dad was. He was called the father of the Green Revolution because he developed a wheat and different types of how you plant wheat so that he could feed the world, because in the 70s there was mass starvation in India and Pakistan and in certain parts of Latin America, and he is known to have saved more than 1 billion lives by what he did with wheat. Now he was doing the wheat, he was crossbreeding all these different wheats, which he did it without any electronics. Can you imagine doing all this without calculators or computers? He did it all with his what? Brains. And he wrote everything down in a notebook. So he would take a wheat and he would crossbreed it with something else so that it would become resistant to different diseases, and he'd write all this down in his notebook. So just think about how that would go nowadays if we didn't have computers. Do you all use computers?
Yeah.
Okay, and what happens when you need to find out information? Where do you go?
Google.
Google. Well, there were no Googles back then. So he did it all with his brain. And he worked really hard. He had a great work ethic. And he got that from living in Iowa. People in Iowa taught him how to be a hard worker and how to help other people. He was also an athlete. He wrestled at, back then, Crestwood. Isn't this how Crestwood? Crestwood High School. And he was an all-American wrestler. He went to the University of Minnesota and continued wrestling. And now he is in the Wrestling Hall of Fame in Stillwater, Oklahoma. And when my brother and I were young in Mexico, my brother needed some kind of baseball. And they didn't have Little League Baseball in Mexico. So my dad started Little League Baseball in Mexico. Because when my dad was young, he used to sit in the kitchen, and you'll see the radio is it in the kitchen? Yeah. Yeah. You'll see the radio in there, and he and his dad would listen to the Cubs. You know where the Cubs are? Chicago Cubs?
Yeah.
Well, they'd listen to that. So he decided that he wanted to be a Cubs baseball player. He never made that, and even at the end, he still wished that he had been a baseball player. And so he got to throw out a pitch towards the end of his life at the Cubs game. He is known to have won, well, he did win, the Nobel Peace Prize, the Congressional Gold Medal, and the Medal of Freedom. And those are 3 medals that only 6 people in the world have ever won. And some of those, and I can't remember them all, and I should. One was Mother Teresa. One was Martin Luther King, Wiesel, who survived the Holocaust, my dad, and I can't remember the other 2. Mandela from South Africa, and I'll think of the 6th one in a minute. But I have brought these medals to show you. And now he has won many, many medals. And most of his medals we have put in the archives either at University of Minnesota or Texas A&M. But my brother and I decided to keep some of these so that we could come around and try to inspire some of you young people with what he did, what my dad did. Now, as I said, he was born and raised on a small farm here in Iowa. So who knows, right here, right in the next farm over, right? And you're going to go see where he was born. Who knows, someday you all are, one of you is going to win the Nobel Peace Prize, right? There's one other big award that he's gotten, and it's because the people of Iowa have put him into the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol. How many of you have been to Washington, D.C.? Not very many yet, but I'm sure that you all will get there someday, okay?
Yeah.
And when you go there, you go in and you'll see this statue of my dad, and I don't know why we don't have pictures of it here, but we'll have to get some here for you. Pictures of a statue of my dad that Iowa put in. Each state has 2 statues in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol, so there are only 100 statues there. And Iowa, the citizens of Iowa with the legislature voted him in, so they put this statue in 4 years ago, and it is magnificent. And it represents Iowa because he is from Iowa. And it also represents agriculture, which if we don't have agriculture, we don't have food. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
So think how important you all know, because you've been raised in this area. You see plants, you see corn, you see oats, you see alfalfa, all these different things. But kids in the cities, like my grandson Luke, where is he? Running around. He's never been on a farm before. So you all know how important producing food is. Therefore, if we have food, we have happy people. My dad always said every child born into the world needs 3 things: adequate food, adequate health care, and education. And if you have education, you probably will have the other 2. So education is very important. And I sound like a teacher, right? Because I am a teacher. And I've taught high school for 40 years. But your education is very, very important.
And what did you teach?
I taught Spanish in
Why
high school.
Why don't you say some words in Spanish?
And then I also created a community service program in Dallas, Texas, that I worked with 2 high schools, and all the kids had to go do community service. And community service means you go out and help other people. You become humanitarians. So, por eso, nosotros les vamos a enseñar unas cosas. There's some of my Spanish. All right, this is the Nobel Peace Prize, and this was given to him in 1970. And I'm going to let you all come up and look at these in a minute. This is solid gold. And the Nobel Peace Prize is given in Norway. Do you all know where Norway is?
Yes.
Where is it?
Europe.
Europe, right. Okay. And there are different Nobel Prizes. There's one for literature, there's one for science, there's one for chemistry, there's one for physics, there's one for economics, and then there's a Peace Prize. And when Sweden and Norway divided a long time ago, they gave Norway the Peace Prize to give. So the day that they give all the Nobel Prizes, which is December 10th, and just this month they'll be announcing the Nobel Prizes coming up shortly. They'll say who's getting them for this year. They're going to, December 10th they give all the Nobel Prizes out. But my dad went to Norway and received his. And I was fortunate, my brother and I were fortunate enough to go with him, and then my mom. So we got to see the King of Norway give him his Nobel Peace Prize. Then he's also, that next year after he won that, or 2 years later, President Ford of the United States honored him with the Medal of Freedom. And this is for a person that is a private citizen that has demonstrated his care for the world. So this is the Medal of Freedom, and this was given in 1972. And then recently, 2007, he was given the Congressional Gold Medal, which was given to him by President Bush. And here on this is solid gold, like the others are. And this is a picture of a sculpture of my dad, or whatever. And you can see this, go look at this in a minute. And then on the back, they made him write, they wanted a saying. And he said, no, just put some wheat on there. And they go, no, Dr. Borlaug, we have to have some words. So this is an act of Congress. Congress had to vote on this. And it says the first essential component for social justice is adequate food for all mankind. And that means that all mankind, it doesn't matter whether you live in Iowa, whether you live in Mexico, whether you live in Africa, India, Pakistan, Iraq, Iran, anywhere. We all, as human beings, should deserve to have food. Is that right?
Yes.
And there are people in this world that are starving to death. So by the year 2050, we're going to have more population than we've ever had before. And we've got to figure out, and you all are the future, how are we going to feed all these people? It doesn't just happen. So that's why your education is so very important. Here's his yearbook from
Crestwood.
And this was his junior year. And here's his name. He wrote his name here. And then he's got all these different people signed them. You know how you sign yearbooks?
They don't yet.
Oh, you don't have yearbooks yet?
You get yearbooks
Yeah.
with other pictures in it, yeah.
Okay.
Anyway, I don't even know if they do yearbooks anymore. I hope they do.
They do.
Oh, because I figured Facebook took over or something.
Yeah.
But anyway, all his friends signed this, and then my mother it's kind of funny because when all this was going on, before he won the Nobel Peace Prize, we didn't think it was any big deal, all this stuff he brought home, and my mom would just kind of throw it in the drawer or something. We didn't know he was going to be famous, or I guess, I don't know, but we don't have very much written down. People go, why don't you have any pictures? Well, we do, we have a whole box of pictures, but nobody wrote on them, so we don't know when they were. Anyway, here's his high school ring from Crestwood, but it was Crestwood back then.
Crestwood High School.
High school from 1932. So Alan's going to let you come up here, and you want to tell him something? Alan, as I said, he's his first cousin. So Alan knew my dad as a young man, more so than I did, obviously.
Right. But anyway, the house you're going to go to over at the birthplace, that house there, Dr. Borlaug was born in that house. Also, my father was born in that house.
Did you tell him about the oats?
Oh, no. One of my first memories of Norman, I was probably about 10 years old. I was in 4-H, and he came driving in a car in our yard one day with a rental car from Minneapolis. And he opened the trunk, and he threw out 2 bags of oats. And he says, here, plant these. See how they do here in Iowa. And I planted them for a 4-H project. And those oats yielded very, very high. And neighbors from all around came around asking if they could get seed oats from me. And so we had those oats grown in our community for many, many years. It was a seed oat called Rodney seed oats. And Norman had developed that down in Mexico. But anyway, we were very proud of Norman. I remember the day my mother called me. I lived in Decorah at that time. She says, Norman just won the Nobel Peace Prize. I didn't know what she was talking about, but it was something very special.
Well, I was living in Wisconsin, and I just had my first baby, and I was going to visit some friends for coffee, and I heard on the radio that this man from Iowa had won the Nobel Peace Prize. I thought, oh, that's interesting. And it said Norman Borlaug. I went, oh my gosh, that's my father. And I had no clue that any of this was going to happen. And my mother had tried to call me that day. Actually, when that call came into Mexico, my dad had already gone out to the fields. And somebody called and said, is Dr. Borlaug there? And my mom goes, no, he's already gone. And they said, well, we're calling from Norway, and we want to talk to him, interview him, because he just was announced as winning the Nobel Peace Prize. And she thought, that's just somebody making a pun. She said, well, he's not here, and hung up. And then the phone rang again several times, and she kept saying, no, he's not here. And they said, he has won the Nobel Peace Prize. So then when New York Times or Washington Post or somebody called, she thought, well, maybe this is real. So she had to call his office, and they sent a driver out. And he was out in the fields about 50 miles from Mexico City. She went out and told him, she hollered across the field, Norm, you won the Nobel Peace Prize. And he goes, yeah, right. And he kept working, and she said, you've got to come back into Mexico City. And he wouldn't come back in until all of a sudden all these people from the newspaper people came and started interviewing him, and they realized, well, it was real. And he said that changed his life. Not for the good, really, because then he couldn't spend as much time in the fields like he wanted. He was very hands-on. He wanted his hands dirty. He worked hard. Okay, you all can come up here and look at these, and then you can go around and look at the house. This is the original house, so a lot of the furnishings are the original furnishings.
Is there like a
Yeah, questions?
Can we take pictures?
Sure.
Don't touch.